Hey y'all, I'm Tyson. This time we're making a claymore. I like creating designs that use contrasting woods, so for this sword I used lighter beech wood and some reddish jatoba and tried to carry that contrast in the blade and crossguard. For the blade, I routed out a 1/2-inch channel in the beech wood for almost the entire length of the blade, which was cut in several passes to match a corresponding length of jatoba. I left the curve of the router bit, marked that on the jatoba, and sanded it to shape, and then repeated those steps on the opposite side. Finally, I could glue it all together. I haven't tried combining a blade in this way before, but it was a pretty safe bet, and with a bit of cleanup, it worked perfectly. I had a rough idea how I wanted the blade to transition to the tang, so I used a few marking tools to create some guidelines and also marked the tapering of the blade. Then I could rough cut the shape out on the bandsaw. A few quick passes with a hand plane help clean up the bandsaw cut and straighten the blade edge. And a bit of cleanup work with a file finish out the blade form. Once the shape is complete, I usually leave the blade in this state to use as a reference for creating the crossguard and handle, and then towards the end of the build, chamfer or round over the edges with a wide panel bit at the router table. The crossguard was another area where I laminated some beech and jatoba together, and then laid out guidelines for a nice, wide crossguard. This will be half of the guard, which was cut out on the scroll saw. And then I could use that piece to draw the second half and cut it out as well. I'm going to encase the blade between these two pieces, so to match the blade width I needed to trim away some of the beech wood. Then mark the area that will need to be cut out using the sword blade as a reference. To cut away most of the waste, I used my miter saw, set up to stop at the correct depth. This way I could see the lines I was cutting to, though a table saw and sled would also work well. To allow for the full cut, you can see how I had to use a sacrificial board to offset the cut, and making a series of cuts took away most of the material. The rest of the material could be cut away with a chisel at the bench. This is also a good view of how I taper the tang of the blade into the handle. This is more work rather than creating just a straight tang, but it creates a stronger connection between the handle, the crossguard, and the blade, so I think it's worth doing. Final test fit shows this is ready to be glued together. And later sanded smooth and tapered a bit towards the ends. On to the handle. I took a solid stick of jatoba, cut it in half, and then set my router bit to cut to the depth of half of the blade. Then I could route out channels in each side to hold both the sword blade and at the other end the pommel. After checking to make sure the tang will fit, the handle was glued back together. And then I used a long ruler to help create the form of the handle. It's a subtle taper, but made for a nice grip. The edges of the handle were rounded over at the router table and could have been left at this state. It was already pretty comfortable, but I wanted to try a bit more hand shaping, so I clamped it up and used some rasps and files to refine the profile. I think I used 3 different files, a really aggressive one for general shaping, and then 2 others to get it close to final finish. Some sandpaper strips provided a final, really smooth surface. At this point, I had the major parts finished, and it's super gratifying to fit them together. And now that I've shown the finished pommel, let's put that together. The pommel was also made from some jatoba glued up into a block, and before turning it on the lathe, I drilled and chiseled out a mortise that would attach it to the handle. With that ready, I could spin it up on the lathe, and the only real consideration I had in mind is that I wanted a sort of sphere in the pommel. But the other details just needed to fit correctly to the handle. So once I had established the sphere, I freestyled a few other details, sanded it smooth, and it was ready to go. Now, the classic image of a claymore often is embellished with quatrefoils, but I chose a simpler round design using some of the laminated wood left over from the crossguard. Not having a specific size in mind, I settled on the cap of my glue bottle as a good size and used the scroll saw to rough cut each one. Sanding them smooth was a bit tricky, but it worked okay. I wanted to add some detail to these, so I took a router bit and clamped it up in my drill press, which I knew might not work that well, and indeed the first attempts I made had a lot of chatter. But I found if I clamped the disc tightly within a hand clamp, and then clamped the hand clamp to the table so everything was super secure, and then went slowly, I got pretty good results. After this setup, I drilled all the way through with a Forstner bit, and then I could use that hole in the disc with a dowel to add a chamfer at the router table. You can see I'm spinning the disc with a file. I don't want my fingers near that bit. Finally, I could drill holes in the discs and the guard and join them with a length of dowel. This isn't exact, and you can see I did drill through the surface just a bit, but I just made sure it was well glued all around. So it's time for the big glue up. I taped the blade for some glue squeeze out, used plenty of glue, and attached the handle. With the sword all glued up, I did some final shaping of the guard and the transition to the handle. And then, as a last detail, I wanted to add some decorative transitions between the guard and the blade, so I took some leftover jatoba, cut in a shelf so it would sit flush with both the guard and the blade, then drew in a rough design, and refined it with whatever objects I had on the bench to create some clean curves and lines. Cutting a small part like this, I like to use some clamps to help hold the part and give me better control in the movement. And then once the rough cuts were done, I could do a bit more shaping with files and it was ready to glue on. I finished the sword with BioShield's Hard Oil number 9. It's simple, it leaves a very natural surface, and it's what I had. So I hope you liked the build. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and what you might like to see in a future build. Thanks for watching.